Even if you don't recognize shadow IT by name, you've probably recognized the symptoms of it. Someone in the accounting department who has an Access database that manages all their books for a certain part of the business. IT had nothing to do with it, but somebody knew a little bit about how to whip up an Access database, and now the organization has become really dependent on it. But it hasn't gone through any of the normal organizational approval processes. It doesn't adhere to the coding standards or the security patterns or any of the things that are important to building robust and sustainable software. Shadow IT is not a new risk. It's not a risk specific to the cloud. It's one that we've had for decades now. But what changes with the cloud is just how easy it is for anyone to turn around and stand up services that run for an organization but totally circumvent all of those IT controls. Let me give you an example. This is DigitalOcean, and they've become really popular in recent times for being very cost-effective and very fast. You can get an SSD cloud server up and running in only 55 seconds. Now that's very enticing, and it exemplifies that cloud characteristic of on-demand self-service. This is what we want out of a cloud. But of course, by making it so easily accessible and so fast to spin up, just about anyone can do it. So from a shadow IT perspective, the risk we have now is corners of the organization standing up their own cloud implementations, often without any engagement whatsoever with IT, and totally skirting around the organizational controls that should govern the way things like the cloud is actually stood up. The very thing that makes the cloud so attractive is the same thing that's increasing the risk of shadow IT. Let's go and talk about some ways that we can manage this better. Here's a few things to think about when it comes to reducing the risk of shadow IT. So first of all, actually understanding which cloud resources are already in the organization. You may find that you already have shadow IT. Go and find out where those pockets of cloud actually exist. Now, of course, you also want to know who's actually creating them. Remember that cloud services are not necessarily virtual machines running somewhere in an IaaS sort of model. There could be SaaS implementations. For example, is someone using SurveyMonkey? Perfect example of software as a service. And has that actually passed through the appropriate organizational approval controls? It's not just who's creating these services, but who's then using them. So how much of the organization now has a dependency on these services? The difference between a few people in one department and hundreds of people across the organization is going to determine how you try and unify these little pockets of cloud into a more cohesive organizational strategy. Now, you may well find that there are pockets of the organization where cloud exists and it does actually adhere with compliance and security policies. But equally, the ease of standing up these services means you'll probably find corners of the organization where there's shadow IT cloud that doesn't adhere. I've seen many cases of shadow IT in the corporate world over many years. And one of the things that always struck me is that they're usually solving an actual business problem. Most of the time, shadow IT doesn't pop up without a good reason. And what you'll usually find is that there is some discrete business problem that people standing up these services are trying to solve. So what I'd encourage you to try and do is when you see shadow IT pop up in this fashion, is to think about what the underlying problem is. Why is there shadow IT here? Why couldn't they get this service through the formal IT channels of the organization? So in a case like cloud, if someone's going out and getting virtual servers from DigitalOcean in only 55 seconds, what can the organization better do to make those machines more readily accessible within the constructs of a formal cloud strategy? Clearly the technology exists. DigitalOcean can do it in 55 seconds. How can you help the person that really genuinely needs a server quickly get that machine without skirting around the organizational controls? So that's shadow IT, and indeed that is the organizational security considerations module. Let's go and summarize it briefly.